The first reading today is Deuteronomy 30, verses 15 to 20. See, I've set before you today life and prosperity, death and adversity. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I'm commanding you today, by loving the Lord your God, walking in his ways, and observing his commandments, decrees, and ordinances, then you shall live and become numerous, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to possess. But if your heart turns away and you do not hear but are led astray, bow down to other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall perish. You shall not live in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life so that you and your descendants may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying him and holding fast to him. For that means life to you and length of days, so that you may live in the land that the Lord swore to give to your ancestors, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. The second reading is Luke chapter 14, verses 25 to 33. Now large crowds were traveling with him, and he turned and said to them, Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and even life itself, cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry the cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, intending to build a tower, does not first sit down and estimate the cost to see whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he's laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it will begin to ridicule him, saying, This fellow began to build and was not able to finish. Or what king going out to wage war against another king will not sit down first and consider whether he's able with 10,000 to oppose the one who comes against him with 20,000? If he cannot, then while the other is still far away, he sends a delegation and asks for the terms of peace. So, therefore, none of you can become my disciples if you do not give up all your possessions.
Thank you. Those are two kind of weighty texts for this morning. They can be intimidating texts, so we'll try to unpack them a little bit and see if we can get something important out of those. I've called this today Life and Death, Life or Death, Choose Wisely. And I have a picture of a fork in the road there, with one way looking relatively easy, the other not so easy. So the Deuteronomy text, see, I have set before you today life and prosperity, death and adversity. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I am commanding you today by loving the Lord your God, walking in his ways and observing his commandments, decrees, and ordinances, then you shall live and become numerous. And the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to possess. This passage in Deuteronomy 30 comes after a passage that I make reference to quite often, Deuteronomy 28, where Moses lays out for the children of Israel blessings and cursings. Blessings for being obedient to God and curses for being disobedient to God. So this is kind of the tail end of that whole way of thinking, the way Moses thought about life, the way Moses perceives that God gives life. The curses that he makes reference to 2 chapters earlier are said to come from God himself. For instance, in Deuteronomy 28:20, the Lord will send upon you, this is if you're not obedient, the Lord will send upon you disaster, panic, and frustration in everything you attempt to do, until you are destroyed and perish quickly on account of the evil of your deeds, because you have forsaken me. You see how Moses perceives that if you're disobedient, that the Lord will actively oppose you. You see that? And then he speaks also in the curses of illness and blindness. The Lord will afflict you. Who? The Lord will. In other words, Moses perceives God as the afflictor. He said, God will afflict you with boils of Egypt, ulcers, scurvy, the itch of which you cannot be healed. The Lord will afflict you with madness, blindness, confusion of mind. You shall grope about at noon as blind people grope in darkness, but you shall be unable to find your way, and you shall be continually abused and robbed without anyone to help. So in Moses' way of thinking, if you're disobedient to God, you can expect these kind of things from God himself. The curses for disobedience include God bringing also not just disfavor and not just illness, but that he will actually send enemy armies against you. In Deuteronomy 28:53, in the desperate straits to which the enemy's siege reduces you, you will eat the fruit of your womb, the flesh of your own sons and daughters whom the Lord your God has given you. So this is pretty nasty stuff. He's perceiving of God, Yahweh, as sending even the enemy armies against you to siege you to the point where you have to eat your own offspring. He's talking about cannibalism here. So this is the mindset that the children of Israel had about God. And where did they get it from? They got it from Moses. It didn't just pop into their head, but they also got it from their surrounding cultures, the cultures that they came out of. This is the way all cultures at the time perceived of God or their gods. If we go back to Deuteronomy 30, the text for today, this text is offering the Israelites a choice then. After fully describing the blessings that God would give you for being obedient to him and the curses that God himself would send upon you for being disobedient, Moses offers the Israelites a choice. And he says, choose life and prosperity, or choose death and adversity. This is what the writer of Deuteronomy lays before the children of Israel as the choice. Now the Luke text, this is Jesus speaking, and he says, this is a Luke recording what would happen. Now large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and he turned to them and said to them, whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and even life itself, cannot be my disciples. Now this is one of those cases where, we know Jesus loved people. All right? That was obvious that Jesus loved people, but he had a problem with crowds. And when the crowd started following him and gathering around him, he would sometimes say things like this to thin the crowds. He would say something to make it difficult for the crowds to continue to follow him. He did it another time. After feeding the multitude, they followed him across the Sea of Galilee, and he said his most offensive sermon. This one, I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats of this bread will live forever, and the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. So Jesus said to them, very truly I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats of this bread will live forever, and the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. Do you see what Jesus is doing in comparison to the Moses text? The Moses text said cannibalism would be a result of the curse of God. Jesus comes along and says, no, do this. Do this thing that Moses said would be a curse from God. Eat my flesh and drink my blood. You see why that could be a very offensive move to make for Israelites. In verse 66, it says, because of this sermon, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. I don't know of a single church growth consultant that would propose something like this. This is not how to build a megachurch with sermons like this. We tend to look at megachurches and bestow great honor on them for the size of their congregations. But Jesus didn't seem to be concerned so much about the size of his congregation. He actually said things that really made them think hard about, do I really want to follow this guy? He knew something about crowds, though. Crowds are fickle. Crowds quickly turn from admiring their leader to calling for the death of their leader. The crowds that followed him also called out, crucify him, when they were given the choice between him and Barabbas. They called out, crucify, crucify him. We have no king but Caesar. So crowds have the tendency to choose their leaders according to who they perceive is going to benefit them the most. So then in verse 26, 25 and 6, large crowds were traveling with him, and he turned and said to them, whoever comes to me does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and even life itself, cannot be my disciple. So most interpreters say that verse 26 here is Jewish hyperbole. It's over-the-top language to make a point. And I can't really disagree with that. But Jesus also said in Matthew 10, "Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. I've come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and one's foes will be members of one's old household." So we talked about this recently and noticed that the division Jesus spoke about was within families. He's not giving us an okay to be warriors against people willy-nilly. He's saying the revelation that he would bring would even cause divisions within the foundational unit of society, the family. And here he's pushing the idea even further, using hyperbolic language to get the attention of the crowd. He's saying his followers must even reconsider the family. What is this foundational unit of society? And I want to focus on this last phrase. And even life itself cannot be my disciple. So what is he saying? Whoever comes to me and does not hate even life itself cannot be my disciple. So of course it's hyperbolic again. He's kind of over the top. But in less hyperbolic terms, what's he saying? He's saying disciples of Jesus must rethink life itself. They must rethink what is life made of? What is the point of life? Remember the choice that Moses gave in Deuteronomy 30? I've set before you life and prosperity, or death and adversity, if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I am commanding you today by loving the Lord your God, walking in his ways, observing his commandments, decrees, and ordinances. Then, it's a if-then statement. If you're a computer programmer, you understand if-then statements. If this condition is met, then this will happen. This is very conditional. Then you shall live and become numerous, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to possess. So in other words, life in Deuteronomy is defined as transactional. A transaction or a condition must be met in order for you to have this life that as Moses perceives it. Or in other words, life is earned in Deuteronomy by obeying the commandments of the Lord. If you obey what the Lord tells you to do, you will earn the reward of life. But life, according to Jesus, is not transactional. Let's look at John 6. He says, I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats of this bread will live forever, and the bread that I will give, a gift is not transactional, right? The bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. So Jesus said to them, very truly I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Here's that sermon again. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats of this bread will live forever. And the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. Jesus says here that life is a gift, that it has nothing to do with obedience. Do you see that? Life is received as a gift from God through the incarnation of Jesus, or through his body. His body is his incarnation, right? It's how he comes into the world, how God reveals himself in the world. So according to Jesus, our obedience or disobedience has nothing to do with receiving life as Jesus understands it. Life is freely given to all of humanity through the body of Jesus, or through the incarnation of God in Jesus. So we can review like this. In Deuteronomy, life is earned via obedience, or it's via a transaction. I'm going to do this, God will then give me life. In Jesus, life is a gift given and received via the incarnation or the body of Christ. So there's a fundamental discrepancy between how Moses and Jesus understand life. There's a difference there. In Luke 14, Jesus says that we must even hate or at least reconsider what life is if we are to be his disciples. And then the next statement Jesus makes in Luke 14 might help us figure out what he's talking about here. If you don't pick up your own cross and come after me, you can't be my disciple. So following right on with this hyperbolic language, Jesus kind of makes it a little bit more clear. If you don't pick up your own cross, come after me, you can't be my disciple. The gift of life that Jesus gives is his own body. And he would lay his own body down as a gift in order that we could receive life. And not only that, he tells us that if you're going to be his disciple, you have to do the same thing. You have to be have that mindset about how you live your life. This can seem paradoxical. The church has always said Jesus died in order to give us life. Most evangelicals would go that far because we see that as a benefit to us. Jesus died in order that we can have life. So we even sometimes think of it transactionally, where I think that's not the best way to think about that. But then Jesus goes beyond giving his own life here and says his disciples must do the same. That's where it's a little harder to swallow. It's easy for us to say, yes, Jesus died to give me life because it's all a benefit to us. Right? We all just benefit from that. But then when he goes a little step farther and says, yeah, I did that to give you life, but if you want to be my disciple, you need to think of life the same way. You need to do life the same way. The gift of life that Jesus gives us is to be the same gift that we give others, in other words. He empowers us to give life in the same way he does. I personally don't like this much. I'd rather go back to Moses' transactional way of receiving life. Because then it's in my control. I can control how God gives me life. I can get blessings out of God if I'm just obedient to him. But Jesus doesn't seem to be too concerned about that. He's more concerned about us living a life the same way he lived his life for the benefit of others. But his gift of life requires us to be the ones laying down our lives for other people. Okay. Let's go back to Cain and Abel. Remember how the founding human civilization began. It began by Cain killing his brother Abel. Then he went off and founded the first city. Cain killed his brother because he saw his brother as a threat to him. Or Cain thought his brother had something that Cain wanted but couldn't get access to. So Cain sought to enhance his life by taking the life of his brother. He thought, I could have a better life. I could have more substantive life if my brother was out of the picture. Paul Nichterlein says it like this: at the murder which founds human culture, killing the scapegoated victim was mistakenly taken as the way to stay alive. Scapegoating is a choosing of someone else's death in the community's desperate effort to stay alive. That's what Cain was doing. He was taking the life of his brother in order to enhance his own life or to stay alive. Scapegoating does that. We've talked about scapegoating quite a bit, how societies settle on one person or a group of people in which to identify themselves over and against. And it's okay if that person dies because they're deserving of it. Nichterlein goes on, and this is very insightful, I think. Since the very beginning, then, we have been choosing death when we thought we were choosing life. We were choosing death when we thought we were choosing life. We have been wrong from the beginning. Jesus chose death on the cross, and disciples must follow in carrying their own crosses in order to have revealed the life that God has chosen for us since the beginning. The cross appears to be a choosing of death only because we human beings have been wrong in our choosing since the beginning. God takes this wrongness, this human choice of death, masked as life, and turns it into the source of true life. This is why Jesus can say things like this: for those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will save it. It's a paradoxical statement, but you see, what Nichterlein is saying, we've been mixed this up from the beginning. Even before Cain and Abel, when Adam and Eve chose the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, in other words, chose to begin judging people as to right and wrong, what was the penalty for that? God said, in that day you do that, you'll die. So they chose death thinking that they were choosing life. Cain did the same thing. Jesus then reminds us of that. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will save it. Or he said things like, so therefore none of you, this is the last verse of the text for today, therefore none of you can become my disciple if you do not give up all your possessions. This seems incredibly challenging. Especially the more stuff you have, the more challenging it might become, right? But Girardian scholars note that the word possessions here can also be translated in the participial form. So it would read this way. So therefore, none of you can become my disciple if you do not give up all your possessing. All your possessing. Does it put a little different spin on it? So the problem then can be understood as the human desire from the time of Cain and Abel through Moses that we can earn or possess life through our own efforts. Jesus is saying his disciples must give up that way of thinking. That life is not found in our possessions or in our possessing things or people. It says his disciples will stop trying to possess things in others in order to find life. Because since Cain made the choice to seek life through the death of his brother, humanity has been playing that scene over and over again. But Jesus says that life is not found in your possessions or in your possessing. Rather, life is given and received as a gift. Now, gifts are very different than things you earn. I mean, I know some people like to give gifts with strings attached, but that's not a real gift, right? That's asking for something in return. Vandy's grandmother gave her a car at one point and said, I'll give you this car if you don't let Russ drive it. And she said, no, I won't receive it. She wouldn't do it with that string attached. And her grandmother acquiesced, and I drove it, but it was a horrible car. We got rid of that car. It was the worst car we've ever owned. It was a Datsun before they made Nissan. Before it changed to Nissan, it was a Datsun F10, little yellow thing. It was ugly to begin with, but it was always breaking down. It was not a good car. So gifts, if they're really gifts, don't come with strings attached. They're freely given and freely received, right? And until we understand this, we'll be searching in vain for life, because if we think life comes through our efforts, through our earning it by what we do, that we find life through that's Moses' idea. That's how Moses thought life came. Jesus says, no, it doesn't come that way. It comes by me freely giving it, you freely receiving it, and then you living that same way in your relationships. So why does Jesus bring the family into this whole discussion? Whoever comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, wife and children, brothers, sisters, even life itself can't be my disciple. Well, isn't it members of our family that we often try to possess or into love-hate kind of relationships with? We don't realize it, but I've heard so many people say of some family member, I can't handle the way they act, but I love them to death. You know that? It's like you can't live with them, you can't live without them. It's families that elicit these strong, really polar opinions, where we love them like crazy. They're part of our family, but they really bug us too at the same time. Like you wouldn't spend time with people outside your family that were like that. You'd just give up on them. But we hang with the people in our family that act like that. For a while sometimes, yeah. But they can be really unhealthy. Like they can lead to domestic violence. They often do. Like in marriages, say a husband who gets angry at his wife when she doesn't live up to his expectations. Where do those expectations come from? Well, typically I think they come from his mother or some other woman that has been important in his life, where he's seen how his mother maybe did things. Those, he may not even realize it, but the way his mother kept the house or did one thing or another becomes his expectations for his wife. And if his wife doesn't live up to those, he gets frustrated and angry with her. So his frustration with his wife is actually a need to possess his performance standard through her. It's not really a frustration with her. It's a frustration that she's not giving him his performance standard. And he's wanting to possess that through his wife. But alternately, if he sees his wife as a gift, he's freed from the need to possess her or to make her live up to some expectation that he has for her. A gift is freely given and received. It's actually absurd to place expectations upon gifts. Right? If some guy gives you a tie you don't like, I mean, I could be really upset and say that I wish that tie looked different than it does, but that's kind of absurd thinking, isn't it? So we don't place expectations on gifts, but we do place expectations on people when we unknowingly make it a transactional relationship. You don't need to work or to do any transaction to receive a gift. So when both parties in a marriage see each other as a gift, freely given in love, then they are on the way to a healthy, supportive relationship, not an exploitive relationship. This works in the other way too, wives toward husbands. Some wives have the same kind of expectations that they place on their husbands. First question is, why do I have those expectations? Why am I expecting that from my husband? And this is some of the most challenging of premarital counseling that we have with people, is talking about, well, what are your expectations for a spouse? And you'd be surprised how many people, the spouse, when they hear it coming out of their fiance's mouth, say, I never knew that. So that's the time to get that out in the open before you put the rings on. So sibling rivalry is another case. Sibling rivalry is about two siblings jockeying to receive the most favor from a parent, especially when younger kids, right? That they are trying to get the parent's favor. It's transactional. It's an attempt to earn the love of the parent by outperforming the sibling. We've always heard stories about one sibling that's a really good student, another one that's not, and the student that's not so good is in this rivalry with the other one. Why does he do that? Well, maybe the parents are giving them the idea that they favor the student who does better more. In other words, the parents are expecting some kind of transaction in the way they dole out their love toward their kids. When you do that, you put your kids at odds with one another. And you actually set that up, that circumstance. But if a parent gives their love freely and equally and doesn't require their kids to earn it, rivalries don't arise so often. So, life or death, choose wisely. So if you look at this slide, the path on the left looks wide, smooth, and an easy walk. The one on the right is narrow, rough, uneven, covered with roots and obstacles. Deuteronomy 30 says that if we obey God, our life will be the smooth path on the left. Right? No sickness, no enemies coming against us, no blindness, no curses. But Jesus seems to be saying that to be his disciples, we must take up our crosses and follow him on the path that he takes. Here's the question. Did Jesus' path look more like the one on the left or the one on the right? I think definitely more like the narrow, rough path on the right. Here's another question. Was Jesus obedient in going to the cross? Philippians says, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. So there is obedience involved in following Jesus. Jesus was obedient in going to the cross. And that path led to the cross. So what does Jesus say about all this? Enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the road is easy that leads to destruction, and there are many who take it. For the gate is narrow and the road is hard that leads to life, and there are few who find it. That doesn't sound much like Moses in Deuteronomy 30. Jesus also said, very truly, I tell you, unless a grain of wheat falls to the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Those who love their life lose it, and those who hate their life in this world will keep it for eternal life. Whoever serves me must follow me, and where I am, there will my servant be also. Whoever serves me, the Father will honor. So death leads to resurrection life. You don't have resurrection without first dying. You ever heard of anything being resurrected that didn't die? No, that's the way it works. This is the narrow way that Jesus talks about. Deciding to pick up your cross, die to the life that you've been clinging to, so that you can be raised in newness of life. It's like that old saying, if you want something new, you got to release your grip on the other thing that you're holding on to so strong, because you can't hold them both, right? And Jesus defines eternal life in a particular way in John 17. And this is eternal life, that they may know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent. So Jesus perceives of life as a relationship with God, not a transactional reward for obedience versus disobedience. Jesus understands life very differently. He sees it as a gift that is freely given to us from the Father, and that we should also live our lives in that same way, as giving our lives as gifts to those around us.